All right. So as our attendees trickle in, I just wanted to be the first to welcome you all to this evening's presentation. It's called Unpacked, the law school application process. I am Justin Williams. I'm the Associate Director of Admissions and Diversity Recruitment here at Wayne State University Law School, and I will be your chaperone, as it were, for the evening. We're going to talk about this law school application process. I think there's some mystery that surrounds it for students, and really there's a lot of questions that exist about what it's like now in this new environment, what's changed, what's the same. I think students who find themselves or people who find themselves in this space generally fit into a few buckets, right? There are those who are applying fresh for the first time this fall and want to get a head start on things, get some information. This is going to be great for you. There are those of you who are maybe looking at this as like a second career move, right? So, I've been out working for a few years or a lot of years, or I've got I'm retiring and I'm thinking about doing this as a next thing. Hopefully this will be good for you too. And there are also those people who maybe weren't successful, right, in the last cycle, who are trying to get maybe a leg up on the process and figure out how they can best position themselves for favorable outcomes in this cycle. And I'm hoping that this content is satisfactory and gets you some insight too as well. Now remember, we'll be going through some questions at the end. And if you do have questions, feel free to fire those off in the chat and I will try to get to as many of them as possible. Just a heads up, when I do the Q&A session, typically if I see questions that sort of fit under an umbrella, I'll answer the umbrella question. So if you feel like I'm not answering your question specifically, it's not because I'm dodging it or don't want to. It's just that sometimes for the sake of efficiency and the time that we have, it's better for me to bundle questions together and answer sort of the big idea as opposed to the very specific question. And if there's a very specific question that we don't get to that you would like answered, you can definitely communicate with us offline to try to get that answered and have that conversation. So let's get right into things this evening. So COVID-19 has changed a lot of things for a lot of people, right? And I think that two of the biggest questions that I get when I'm having these kinds of conversations with prospective law students is how has it changed the law school admissions timeline, right? And then how has it changed the way that law schools review files? What I will say, at least to the first question, in this past cycle is that we were probably extending offers of admission a little later in the cycle than we would in years past because there was so much uncertainty in our space around what was going to happen with the students that we had admitted. Were they actually going to show up? Would some of them, sort of find themselves in this space that we're in where it's hybridized, virtual, in-person sort of scenario and say, no, this isn't quite for me, and then decided it wasn't what they wanted to do anymore, right? And I think there's some truth to that for most law schools. I think that next cycle we'll probably have our arms around this a little tighter. And hopefully, right, we'll be going back to something like the normal way of doing things for next fall. And so our timeline will probably hew a little bit closer to that. But I think where we are at this point is that we're reserving the right, to extend and manipulate the timeline so that we can make the best decisions possible and get the best and brightest into our incoming class. And again, I think that's probably true for most of our peer schools out there in the universe. I think the second question is how has it changed the way the schools review files, right? And it's an interesting question, right? Because I think what students are really asking is, are we sort of loosening restrictions, right? Has the evaluation process become less sort of stringent, maybe, right, than it was before this? And the answer to that is, I think no, right? We're looking for the same things that we always are looking for in this process, which we will get to. But I think that, the general rule of thumb is that we're still looking for the brightest and best to be a part of our class. And that hasn't changed, and COVID-19 hasn't changed that. So let's talk about one of the bigger pieces of this puzzle, at least in terms of the law school application process, the LSAT, right? So in a normal sort of space, the LSAT looks and functions a very particular way. But what we know is that in COVID-19, things have changed for everybody, the Law School Admissions Council included. They are the administrators of the test. If you have been engaged and involved with them at all to this point, then you will know that there is something called an LSAT Flex that they've been offering to LSAT takers because things have changed as it relates to the ability for them to administer the test in person, right? I think that broadly speaking, the goal for LSAC is to offer you all the safest version of the test, right? So how do we get us to a place where we're offering this test in a way that is advantageous for the students and also safe for them? There's a lot of information that they've put out there about that. What I do know is that if you are registered for one of the offerings of the LSAT that was slated to occur this fall/early winter, so this calendar year, be prepared for that to be the LSAT Flex. So all of those updates came out to us as law school admissions professionals that test would be administered through the LSAT Flex version. What I will say about the LSAT Flex is that Wayne State is not treating those scores differently than we would a traditional LSAT, right? So we aren't reviewing them with a bias or a handicap, and it doesn't change how we would view you versus a peer who's taken a traditional mainstream LSAT. So if that's a question or concern you had specifically about Wayne, I can assure you that, again, we are treating the LSAT score that you receive as the score, whether it's a flex or not. And my colleague, Kaylee Place, has put into the chat box the links that I have here on the screen. So if you have not viewed those, I would encourage you to do so to familiarize yourself with the LSAT Flex, because there's a really good chance that it could continue and exist in this form for, I think, probably the foreseeable future. Under normal circumstances, the LSAT functions like this, right? You've got 5 35-minute sections of those multiple choice questions, one reading comprehension, one logical reasoning, and then 2 analytical reasoning. Those are your scored sections. And then there's another section that'll be either reading comprehension or logical reasoning that's unscored, that you don't know which one of those sections it will be. But that is the structure of the test. Your score range is from 120 to 180, right? So the lowest you can get is a 120, the highest you can get is a 180. And most students are concerned with the median LSAT score for the schools they prefer they're targeting. So knowing what that is can be helpful to you in the law school application process. But it'll be a number between that 120 and that 180. And then there's a 35-minute unscored writing sample that you have to complete. That's done differently than it has been in the past. It used to be that would happen at the same time, contemporaneously as the rest of the test. Now you have the freedom to complete that section of the exam at a later date, from home, from the comfort of your own home, as it were. The caveat to that is that if you do not complete it timely, your LSAT score may not be released to the schools that you have selected for it to be released to. So I would encourage you to familiarize yourself with the rules of that writing sample and how that functions, and what you need to be thinking about as you do that. So I think that we all sort of understand that the LSAT is a part of this process, right? You can't really get around it. If you want to go to law school, the best option is to take the LSAT. Now, there are some institutions that will accept the GRE. So familiarize yourself with those places. Wayne is not one of those schools. But if you want to broaden and deepen the pool of options for yourself, the LSAT is the test that is the most frequently used in the process of evaluating applicants. And the question is why, right? Why do we rely so heavily on that test? What does it do? What does it tell us that we can't get from other places? And the reality is that it is the most reliable indicator that we have in conjunction with your performance in undergrad to help law schools to an extent, to whatever extent you can, right? Predict a likelihood for success in the first year and beyond based on what we know about that institution. So the score that you get, that number between 120 and 180, is not necessarily an exact number, but a relative score, right? And so that score is relative to your peers who also took that test at that time. And so we're always evaluating you against the pool and against your peers. And so we look at that number and say, all right, well, this kind of person with this kind of profile has typically been successful in our program. Or if it's something that hasn't been successful in our program, we say, well, we know this profile doesn't necessarily scream success here at our institution. So how do we evaluate that person and what do we think about them, right? And so that's why we use the test the way that we do and why we rely on it, because there's reams of data out there that schools will typically revert to help support and inform their decision making on who they select to join their class. So let's go bigger here, right? Take the lens all the way out, 50,000 foot view, and talk a little bit more about the law school application process. So what are law schools looking for? What's the whole point in this process? What's the formula, as it were, that schools are trying to solve for, and when they review an application for somebody who's applied to their institution? So I think the first question, specifically for Wayne, but I think generally for most law schools, is how confident are we that if we admit you, you can succeed in our program, right? And that comes down to academic ability and performance, but also potential. And so talking about the LSAT again, I think the other aspect of it that's helpful is that it gives us an idea of potential, right? There is no academic program that prepares you for law school. It's its own unique sort of thing. Even if you're pre-law, you come in, it's sort of a crucible no matter how you slice it, right? And so what the LSAT does is it tests a set of skills that you will need to demonstrate and possess and sort of activate, right, as a part of your law school career to be successful. And so that number, right, that band of numbers that your score will fall in gives us some idea of the potential you have intellectually in these specific areas. And so we combine that with your undergraduate academic record, which is the performance, your production, right, who you are in a classroom, how you showed up, and what you've achieved, to really get a picture of what it would be like to have you in our building, knowing what we know about ourselves. Now, the hard truth is that the numbers matter, right? That is the business that law schools are in, and the business that you are entering is one where the numbers matter. So the LSAT and the GPA, I think the closer you are in both of those numbers to a school's medians, right? So sort of their big middle scores, right? I think the better your chances that you'd be admitted at those institutions. Now, LORs, or letters of recommendation, can be informative but not dispositive here. So if you're a recent graduate if you've just finished your undergraduate degree and you've got faculty or professors that write letters of recommendation for you, what they can do is sort of corroborate, right, what we know about you on paper as an academic by saying, hey, this is the person I love to have in my classroom, right? They always came prepared, they were ready, they were on time, right? They were a joy to have in the space, and they always excelled, right? So having a faculty member or two, right, who can write a letter of recommendation for you that speaks to those things can be really helpful to you in this process and informative for the committee that's reviewing your application. So once we've answered that question, right, how confident are we that you can do the work, right, that you can succeed here and thrive in our academic environment, then we move to the second question, which is really the soft skills piece, the who are you piece. So what do you bring to the table beyond your ability to be a great student is going to be a plus for us in our building? What's the benefit of the bargain for us as a law school if we admit you, right, in short? So we're looking for personality, right, accomplishments, character, and fitness, right? And so those pieces sort of come out in your personal statement, your resume, to an extent, your letters of recommendation, right? Because the question is, what are people willing to say about you, right? Considering what you're asking them to recommend you for, right? And then any other addenda that you may submit that provide contextual information about you as an applicant. And we'll touch on those a little later in this conversation. But that's sort of what we're doing. So the personal statement gives us an opportunity to get a better understanding of who you are and why you're here, right? What's bringing you to this particular journey, to this particular institution? Why is this the thing that you want to do, right? And I think if you can answer in your personal statement who you are and why you're here at the precipice of pursuing a legal education, then your personal statement has probably done its work. We'll talk a little bit more about the personal statement because I think people always have more questions about it. And so we'll touch on that a little bit later, but that's sort of the bare bones basics of that. So the resume is really a way for you to capture what you've done outside the classroom, right, or beyond your undergraduate experience. That gives us an idea of the kinds of experiences and stories you might have to tell, and what you'll bring to the table, right? That once you're in a classroom with your peers and we're talking about a subject that's of interest to you, or what your viewpoint will be, and whether or not we have enough of that in our class, right? And so that's another place where you can demonstrate the things about you that make you unique, and make you special. Now, this last piece, you versus everybody, is a little less about you and a little bit more about some things you don't have any control over, right? Now, so every institution that you apply to has goals, right? Those are set before you even apply, right? In terms of what you want the profile for the class to look like, the size of the class, the demographics, right? All sorts of different factors that are valued by the institution. And then there's the applicant pool itself. And so you're up against all of those things as you go through the process. And as your application is reviewed, it's reviewed against the backdrop, right? Or in juxtaposition to those things. So if the answer to the first two questions is yes, right? But you're, for some reason, the timing is bad and you apply late, right? And that doesn't jive with the enrollment goals, and maybe the answer is no, or you get waitlisted, right? So there's a lot to think about as it relates to that. And then again, you're also being weighed against your peers, and you don't get to control who else is in the pool at the time that you do apply. So that's the big picture as it relates to what law schools are looking for. But then let's talk about the specific elements that you'll find in the application itself. Now, one thing that's important to remember about this process is that it all happens online. You can't mail us a physical application anymore. And would you really want to? That's a lot of stuff to try to manage and handle and then get to a place and make sure it gets there. So it really simplifies the process. The entire process happens online via the Law School Admissions Council, LSAC. You've heard me mention them before, as they are the administrators of the LSAT. But the application process happens online with them. So if you have not done so, please do this. Visit lsac.org and create your profile, and just tool around their website. There's a lot of really good information on there for those who are thinking about and considering law school, for those who are preparing for and anticipating preparing for the LSAT. Lots of great tools there to help support you in this journey. So I would encourage you to take advantage of them as a resource, and explore what they have to offer to support you as you go on this journey. Like we talked about, the personal statement is also included in that application. It'll be, you'll be able to submit that again via LSAC. Now, the personal statement, I think the thing that I really want to touch on here is how important it is for that to be a good piece of writing, right? I think very often students find themselves stuck on what to write about, but it's also important how you write and how you present it, right? So you want to make sure that this is a professional piece of writing. It's a good representation of you as a writer, because it is an introduction to you as a writer for those who are in the decision-making process. Sometimes they are faculty, sometimes they are legal research and writing faculty. And so they're reviewing this with a different lens, and assessing your ability to write and communicate effectively and clearly. So always keep that in mind when you're thinking about the personal statement. Some law schools will have prompts for you as a part of the application process that they would prefer that you respond to, and as a part of that process of writing that personal statement. So honor those and really do that. Ours is, we don't have a very particular thing, right, that we're asking you to write about. But again, we want to know who you are and why you're here. If you can communicate to us in a way that doesn't take up precious real estate, right? Why you want to do this at Wayne, and it's helpful to the committee to help understand why we're the place that you want to go. For us, the personal statement should be 2 pages, double space, regular margins. Don't do anything weird or funky with the fonts. Make sure that you know what that is, what the personal statement should look like, and what the constraints are at the other schools that you apply to. Resume. So for a lot of folks, the resume creates some questions, right? How long should it be? Should I shorten it? Should I change it? I think the answer is it depends, right? I think for most applicants to law school, you can get away with a 1 to 2 page resume that captures all of the things that you've done post-graduation. If you are a seasoned professional with a significant career behind you, or you're an academic who's got a CV, right? We don't necessarily ask you to change that. Just know that, the peers in the space, right, are probably having shorter resumes, but we wouldn't ask you to truncate your career, right? Because you've done all those things and you've accomplished them. But I guess the rule here is that don't feel obligated to pad out the resume to make it seem like you've done more than you have. If you're coming directly from undergrad or just a couple of years out or a few years out or a handful of years out, right? Don't feel like you're behind the eight ball if you don't have a super long resume. Just make sure that it captures the things that are important about what you've done, and you highlight the things that are the most important for the committee to see and understand as they make this evaluation of you as an applicant. Letters of recommendation. So in this process, you will invite recommenders to submit their letters of recommendation directly to LSAC, right? So you don't have to go get the letters and then scan them in or do anything like that. They can submit those letters directly. For Wayne, we need at least 2 letters of recommendation, but no more than 4. Revisiting a little topic that we touched on earlier, if you are 2 years or less from completing your undergraduate education at the time that you apply, at least one of your letters of recommendation has to come from a faculty member or somebody who's taught you in a classroom. So just something to think about as you're sourcing those letters of recommendation. And then also any addenda that you might have to submit or choose to submit to provide context around things that we might find in the application. So we talked about character and fitness, or I mentioned it earlier. It's a very specific thing, right? And that schools are required to ask you some questions about your character and fitness. And if you respond to those questions with a yes, then you need to provide context around what the circumstance was, right? What happened? What was the outcome, right? Where do things stand today? So if you, had an MIP or something of that nature, where does things stand today? What's up with that? If you've got moving violations and tickets, right? Explaining those things. If it's, if you had a run-in with the law, right? Whatever it is, if you answer in the affirmative to those questions, then you'll need to submit a statement that helps us understand where things stand. Part of that is to protect you, right, on the back end of this process. If you're admitted to that law school as a part of the process of applying to sit for the bar exam, you'll have to declare everything that's basically ever happened to you as an adult, right? And those things have to match. They'll pull your law school application, and if what you declare on the back end in the process of applying to the bar doesn't match with what you have in your application for law school, you'll be asked, well, why do these things not match? And then you'll have to go back and update your application anyway. So be thoughtful about that on the front end, right? If you have a question about a thing, just disclose it. It won't forestall your or foreclose you from being admitted to a law school unless it's a series of violations or something so egregious, right, that it's unlikely that you would even get the opportunity to practice, let alone go to law school, right? Those are some circumstances where a school may decline to admit you based on what you disclose. But again, disclose everything so that you don't run into problems on the back end. There's also some other circumstances in which you might want to submit an addendum. I think the others are really about providing context, again, around some things that might cause question marks in the process. So not everybody comes into the law school admissions process, the application process, with a profile that they feel is an accurate representation of them for any reason, right? So maybe their GPA isn't great, but there's a set of factors that influenced and impacted their ability to be the kind of student they wanted to be. You can provide an addendum that will share some context around what that was, so that the committee understands what the number is, but also why it is, right? Same is true for the LSAT, right? There are plenty of people who will tell you that they are not particularly good at taking standardized tests, but once they get into a classroom setting, they perform a lot better, right, than the test indicates that they would. And so they're invited to submit an addendum that provides context for that and to the committee. Now, I say all that to say, these things do not, sort of put us in a position to dismiss what we see in the application, right? So let's say, your LSAT score is not particularly strong, right? You've got a solid GPA, a good GPA, but the LSAT score isn't particularly strong. submitting that addendum does not erase the score, right? We don't just dismiss the score out of hand, right? But again, it does provide us that context so we understand better what we're seeing and why we're seeing it. And it gives you that opportunity to state your case on why the opportunity should be granted to you irrespective of the score that you have. So the other piece of this puzzle that we receive is something called a JD Credential Assembly Service Report, or JD CAS report. That is submitted to us by LSAC. That CAS report will include your LSAT score, so every score you've received, I think for the last 5 years we will see, and then your undergraduate GPA and transcripts. So as a part of this process, you will need to submit every transcript from every institution you've attended post-undergrad, right? So if you went to a community college for a semester, or you did a study abroad, right, all of that needs to be included. LSAC will combine all of those transcripts together and give us a master GPA. What I do tell people is that it is not uncommon for the GPA that you see on your undergraduate transcript to be a little different than what we get through the LSAC's Credential Assembly Service Report for any number of reasons. If you retake a class, so in the undergraduate system, sometimes those grades will bump, right? So you'll bump the lower grade off, right? That doesn't happen that way when your Credential Assembly Service Report is generated. We see both of the grades, both of those grades are used to calculate that GPA, right? And sometimes if you transfer, right, those credits will just be treated as credit and not count towards your GPA. Those credits, the grades count in the law school application process. So we'll see all of those grades, and those grades will be factored into the GPA as well. So just a heads up about that. We'll talk a little bit more about the Credential Assembly Service a little later in this conversation as well. All right, so a few thoughts as you're thinking about the application process and the timeline, right? My advice is to apply early. I think that the general rule of thumb is for most people, right, the students who are best positioned for success and satisfactory, or at least some clarity in the process, right, is to apply as early as you can, as early as you're ready to, right? For Wayne, our application opened on September 1st. So if you've got all the materials that you need to have to submit the application, you can feel free to submit those now. We will start rendering admissions decisions in January. So those folks who apply earliest will get that clarity earlier. And the other benefit to applying earlier is that it's a rolling process, right? So as we receive applications, we're reviewing them and making those decisions, and there's more room in the class earlier than there is later. And that's just how that works. So if you apply early, you will know sooner where you stand, and we may have a little bit more room to be discretionary, right, in the choices that we make and how we build out the class. So it gives you a little bit of an advantage in the process. I think the other piece of this puzzle is to own the parts of this that you can control, right? So your personal statement, you can control how that looks, right, and what you write about in your story. You can control how you present yourself in your resume. You can control who you select to be a recommender. And the most important thing there is to identify people who will be strong recommenders for you. Not just somebody who will write you a letter of recommendation, because not all letters of recommendation are created equal. I think if you frame it that way, when you're saying, hey, I'd like you to write this letter of recommendation for me, can you write a strong letter of recommendation? Do you believe, based on what you know about me, that you could write a strong letter of recommendation for me? And that gives two things, right? That gives them the room to say, if they don't think so, I don't know, you might want to look for somebody else, right? And it gives you the ability to communicate to them that, hey, this needs to be a knockout letter, right? Because of what I'm trying to accomplish in the story I need to be told. So that's sort of some advice around how you can do that and how you can control that part of the process. What you can't change is your performance in undergrad, right? For most people, that cake is baked by the time they get to this point. Another semester of good grades may or may not bump you enough, right, to get you close to the median, but you can't go back and change that, right? So I wouldn't worry as much about that. The LSAT, you control that part of the process, at least in terms of how you prepare and how you approach test day. So control that part of it, but the rest of the stuff that you can't control, I wouldn't worry too much about. Be thorough, be thoughtful, and be the best you, right? That is the important thing, right? Make sure that errors are few, right? You want this, again, to be a good representation of who you are, and a professional piece of your history, right? Your reputation starts at the application process. And so you don't want there to be, grammatical errors or spelling errors or syntax errors or things that if you were reviewing this, you would catch. So review everything that you submit before you submit it to be sure, again, that it is the best representation of you. It reflects well on you as a person. And then if you haven't planned before, this is the time to start, right? If you have never planned anything, this is the process that you want to take seriously and start mapping out your steps, right? And hopefully the things that we've talked about here have given you some guidance and some things to think about. All right, so let's talk dollars and cents. What makes sense and maybe what doesn't, right? And how you can use your cents, right, to get some dollars out of this process, or maybe spend fewer dollars in this process. So application process costs and hacks. So some of the costs that you will encounter in this process are the actual fees to apply to the law school. Luckily for you, if you're interested in Wayne, we do not charge an application fee. But there are schools out there that will charge that. So if you are thinking about applying to a school, make sure you understand what their fees are so that you can budget out those costs and prepare yourself for that. There's also costs associated with the LSAT and credential assembly service. There's a link there that will take you directly to that so you can see what those costs are and budget those out and plan those as well. But those are the costs that can sometimes surprise people, right? Because they hadn't necessarily anticipated them as a part of the process. Now, the other piece is seat deposit. So if you are extended an offer of admission, you will likely have to submit a seat deposit to the schools that admit you to secure your seat in the class. It's usually a meaningful number, right? It's not like, $50, right? We're talking for Wayne, it's $500 total, right? 2 different deposits, one for $300, one for $200. We do not forgive those seat deposits, right? It is a cost of doing business. It's one of the things that signals commitment to us by you, right? It's one of the ways to signal to us that you intend to join us and that we should not give away your seat in the class. So be prepared for those. Now, there are some hacks, right? For specific schools, you can request an application fee waiver. I would recommend that you ask every school every time, right? Whether or not they offer a fee waiver or what you need to do to receive one if they do charge a fee, and do that thing, right? So that you can reduce that front end cost for yourself. LSAC also offers a fee waiver for their services. The link there will help you better understand what it covers. My understanding is that it's 2 LSATs. There's 1 LSAT writing that will be covered by that, a CAS registration, which includes that letter of recommendation service and access to electronic applications for all LSAC member law schools. Then you'll get 6 of those credential assembly service reports. So the ones that we talked about earlier that include all of your academic biography, as it were, in there. And then it also gives you an opportunity to take that free Khan Academy official LSAT prep, right? That's another thing to think about in this process, is just preparing for the LSAT and how much that costs. There are lots of different ways to do that. And I think that students generally, when I'm advising people on what to do, I encourage them to think about a few things, right? How much time do you have? How much money do you have? And how do you best learn, right? There are lots of different ways to approach this. You can take a formal prep class. You can self-study. You can go in cold. I don't recommend it. I know people that have done it. It's not what I recommend, right? But most people either self-study or they take advantage of a prep course. The prep courses are a little bit more on the are a little bit more of an expense, right? But there's some structure there. There's some formality. There's some professionals who do this for a living, who can frame out what the test is doing to you and what it's asking you to do, so that you are better prepared and better informed on test day and ready to take the test on. You can also try to do it yourself, which is a more cost-efficient option, right? Now that we've got the free Khan Academy official LSAT prep program, which is available at khanacademy.org/LSAT. It's a good resource for those who do need some cost-efficient and cost-effective preparation. And it's also put together by the folks who administer the test, LSAC, in conjunction with Khan Academy. So definitely a thought there for you as you're thinking about the LSAT and how you can go about managing that process. So paying for law school, some things to think about. So I think there's a tendency, right, in the marketplace for us to believe that all lawyers are like buku bucks, right? Big money, big firm jobs, living their best life. But there's a working class for lawyers too, right? You're making, $45, $55, $65, $75,000 a year doing a thing. And you're working class in terms of the lawyer population. And between $45,000 to $75,000 is collectively, right? That's about 50% of what reported salaries were for lawyers in the past several years. So most lawyers, right, are not making six figures. So be prepared for that and be thinking about that as you go through this process. A good resource for you is the National Association of Law Placement, NALP. Their website is nalp.org. They put out a lot of really good data about what opportunities are out there for first-year associates and recent grads, right? But also what's happening in the market for lawyers generally as it relates to salary and what folks are being paid. So if you're going to take this step, be an informed consumer. Know what you're buying, right? Know what you're up against and what the outcomes could be for you, right? The other piece of this puzzle that I think everybody's curious about, scholarship dollars, right? Where do those come from and how do I get them? So scholarships typically fit into a couple of buckets, couple of sort of big buckets, right? The big buckets are merit-based scholarships and then need-based scholarships. Merit-based scholarships are scholarships that are awarded based on your academic strength, right? And then your general fitness to be a part of that institution. But what's leading the conversation there at most schools, Wayne Law included, are your performance in undergrad, so your GPA, that very specific number, and then your performance on the LSAT, right? So that very specific score number that's out there. And the aid is allocated based on those things, right? So we talked about medians earlier, your median LSAT and your median GPA. For most merit-based scholarship programs, the closer you are to the median LSAT and GPA, the better your chances of getting a more lucrative scholarship offer. If you bring both medians, then there's a chance it's going to be a really good scholarship, right? If you bring one or the other, it's probably still going to be a strong and competitive scholarship that offsets the cost of your legal education. Now, some institutions do offer need-based scholarship, and that's, again, based on what your need is identified as by filling out a FAFSA form, right, that includes all of that data. So for those of you who are familiar with the current lending environment for undergrad institutions, right, and how students are paying for school, you'll have to fill out a FAFSA again. For those of you who may be maybe a little old school, right, and aren't used to that, that will be something that you have to do for places that are need-based, right? So that's that piece as it relates to scholarships. Now, schools often have some internal, like, institutional scholarships. Donors may put up some money, right, or alums may put up some money for a very specific scholarship for a very specific kind of student, and then maybe you'll have to take a step to do that, write a paper or compete in a writing competition or something of the sort. Those scholarships are typically smaller, right? One-time offerings, right? The great value of scholarship aid, the great bulk of it rather, happens on the front end of the process, in the admissions process, on that merit-based side or that need-based side, as it were, for those students who are applying to law school. Those institutional scholarships are a little bit more specific and maybe tailored more for current, like students who've already matriculated, right? So currently enrolled students. But for all of the institutions that you're thinking about, you should absolutely check those out and see what options are out there for you as it relates to some of those institutional scholarships to help offset the cost of your tuition. Now, the other piece of this puzzle, right, is, what are the ways are people paying for law school? And if you've done any reading about legal education and law school in general, you know that student loans are a part of the puzzle. And so for most students who are attending law school in 2020, and I believe this is going to remain true, they're paying for their legal education with a combination of either those need-based or merit-based scholarships and then federal student loans. And so you will need to fill out a FAFSA form to access those student loans if you would like to engage those. There's always the option, though, of private loans. So some of you may have a bank, right, that will help you pay for that, or a credit card company or a lender of some sort who will help you pay for the cost of your legal education through private loans. And those are also an option for you. So that's some things just for you to think about and sort of wrap your mind around as you're thinking about how you're going to actually pay for your legal education. This is about the time in the conversation where somebody pops into my chat box and says, well, can I work at the same time that I'm going to law school to help offset the cost? The answer is sure. I think that you can work, right, while you are pursuing your legal education. I think that presents challenges, but for some folks it may be necessary. Luckily at Wayne, we do have a part-time evening program that offers the opportunity for those of you who need to maintain a work schedule to help pay for your legal education, the opportunity to pursue that while also still, going through the process of getting your legal education. So functionally, all of the classes that we would offer in that part-time evening program would occur after traditional work hours, right? So after that 9 to 5 workday is over, you would tool on down to the law school, take a couple of classes over the course of each semester, working toward that ultimate goal of graduation. Most of our students who are in that program finish in 4 or 4.5 years. I think it's a great option, again, for those who are local and who want to choose or who continue to work because they absolutely need to for their survival, or they just want to offset that cost of attending law school. And so I think that can work for people, right? Trying to work and be a student full-time is challenging, which is why for our part-time evening program, those folks are part-time, right, and not full-time in the evening, because we believe that it best sets you up for success if you do it that way. But generally speaking, it is not unheard of for a student to work in law school. I think the first year you might want to consider if there's a way for you not to, because there's a lot of adjustment that happens in that first year and a lot of challenge that's presented by that first year of law school that can be exacerbated or complicated by a need to work full time. And it can present some opportunities for maybe you not to show up as your best self to one or the other, right? So you can do it. It's just not something that would be encouraged at most institutions. So hopefully if you have that question, I've answered it there. And let's talk a little bit more about why Wayne Law, right? Because that's part of why you're here, is to hear about why you should choose us as an institution and what's important about Wayne for you to know. So I think the first thing is the outstanding education, right? I mean, we've been shooting up the rankings. We're into the 80s this year, right? Which is definitely a good place for us to be in those U.S. News and World Report rankings. It puts us closer to where we aspire to be as an institution and reflects that value that we present and offer as an institution. I mean, we've been named the best value law school 6 years in a row. We try to keep the cost of our education low. So for 2020, 2021, the tuition and fees cost us about $33,000 a year, which is, all things considered, pretty affordable, the best cost, the best value in the state, right? At least in terms of the cost of attendance. And we award a lot of scholarship money, about $7 million a year, I think, on average, is where we're at in terms of the amount of money that we offer in scholarship. And then there's the flexibility piece. So we just talked about our full-time day program. We've got our evening program. We've got a combined day-evening program. So if you work, but your schedule's a little bit more flexible and you want to try to take 1 or 2 more classes, then you can go that combined day-evening route, take a class during the day and then a class or 2 in the evening. And that'll allow you, again, to continue to pursue your legal education while maintaining and reserving the right to work as you need to. And then there's also our dual degree option. So you can receive your JD and a master's degree in the subjects that you see there on the screen. And essentially the value is you'll get 2 degrees in roughly 4 years with about 4 classes counting credit-wise towards both programs, right? So that's where you are able to shave some of that time off that you would normally take to complete 2 degrees, right? So instead of 5 years, you're getting it done in 4 or 4.5. The programs that we offer: criminal justice, dispute resolution, economics, history, political science, right? They all sort of feel like a good home, right, for a second degree for somebody who's pursuing a career in law. There's some overlap there, and so that's why we offer those programs. But that is your universal choices. So we don't do sort of bespoke programs. Those are the options if you're interested in a dual degree at Wayne State. But there's also the practical training piece. I think a big part of what we do at Wayne is we endeavor to make practice-ready lawyers, right? We want them to come out and be as ready as one can be to contribute to a law practice in many of the different ways that you can be, right? So everything isn't new to you, right? You've got some exposure to these things, and you're able to come in and contribute in a meaningful way early on in your career. So how do we do that, right? We mandate that you have to participate in some of that practical legal training, right? So clinical programs, externships, internships, those are all options that'll be available to you. You'll be working with our Career and Professional Development Office to access those opportunities and really build out a robust academic career that allows you to take what you've learned in the classroom and apply it in some practical ways, right? So when you're thinking about our clinical offerings, we've got our Asylum and Immigration Law Clinic, our Business and Community Law Clinic, Appeal and Post-Conviction Advocacy Clinic, the Disability Law Clinic, Legal Advocacy for People with Cancer Clinic, right? So lots of different areas where you can shape and influence what's happening in the law and help people in some meaningful ways as a student. Essentially, you'd be functioning as an attorney, right, under the license of a supervising attorney, right? So they'd be checking your work, making sure things are what they're supposed to be, but you'd be doing the work, right? You'd be doing the work that attorneys do while still a student. It'll allow you to build out, right, those skills that you need to make that transition, help you become a better writer, a better advocate, right? And you may find yourself in court, right? I mean, that's just the reality of what this clinical program does. You know, I'm thinking about our Asylum and Immigration Law Clinic, where we had some students actually win asylum for somebody, which is pretty awesome. It's hard to win that for practicing attorneys with several years of career behind them, and our students were able to do it while they hadn't even graduated, right? And so that's the ways that our students are really making an impact in and around Wayne State law, and I think it's a really cool thing and a benefit to you if you choose to come to Wayne. So also location, right? We're located in Midtown Detroit. If you know anything about Detroit right now, there's lots of momentum for things in the city. I think some people like to call it a resurgence or a rebirth. That would imply that Detroit at some point was dead, and it wasn't. And I would encourage you all to think differently about the city when you think about what it means to be in it. The city was vibrant and alive the entire time when nobody was trying to be there. It's good that we've got some eyes and some attention on the city now, and some positive momentum happening there. But being a citizen of the city and being around it, just be aware that it was always alive, and that you are coming into the city, if you are not from here, to contribute to that life, and that there's not a better place to do that than Wayne Law. We're near some of the top law firms, courthouses, Fortune 500 companies, nonprofits, government agencies, right? The whole kit and caboodle. And the best thing about it is that almost anywhere you look, right, where law is being practiced, there is a Wayne Law alum or several in that space. So you get the benefit of the network that Wayne Law has in the city of Detroit. If you want to practice law in the city of Detroit, in this region, right, then there isn't a better option for you than Wayne State, because of the strength of our reputation in the marketplace, and because of our connections in the marketplace, our alumni network, and the relationships that are there. They're in influential positions in hiring, right, and vetting potential attorneys and firms and agencies. So just recognize that that's there for you, and then that's a benefit of being a Wayne State University Law School alum. All right, so I'm going to move to the Q&A portion of this. So I've got a few questions that are already submitted to us, and so I'll try to touch on those. I think I've answered some of them in this conversation, and I'm almost positive I've got some questions in the chat. So let's just go ahead and get this party started. So one of the questions that I've received is about the financial aid offer and the scholarship piece. how are scholarships allocated? And I think I've touched on that, right? It's about performance in undergrad on the merit side, and then your performance on the LSAT. And those are the factors that really drive the conversation as it relates to the scholarship process, right? So that's really what you want to focus on and what we're looking at and looking for in that process. So the application process in terms of timeline, how are decisions made? I think I touched on some of that. For those who apply earliest, they will know earliest. This typically, right, applications open in the fall. We'll start rendering those decisions in January. In any given point in the cycle, it could be 6 to 8 weeks before you hear from us. So let's say theoretically you apply in January, it could be March, right, before you hear back from us, just depending on what volume is like, what the applicant pool looks like, and how we're managing any of those parts of the process. I do get questions about, well, where do I have to be academically to apply, right? And what I mean by that is, can I have an associate's and apply? Can I apply before I finish my undergraduate academic career? So the answer to that question is here, right? Before you can start your law school career, you have to have completed a 4-year accredited bachelor's degree program. So if you are not done with the program, you have to be done before classes start in that fall when you're expected to enroll. If you don't, you cannot enroll. You can't be an undergraduate student and a law student at the same time, unless you're a 3+3 student, which is a unique population, and those students know who they are in the schools where that opportunity is offered. So I'm going to pop into my Q&A here and see what questions do I have. So it looks like I've got a question about how do we review applications and what's the most important, especially in that COVID-19 world. I think that we touched on that, right? The factors are still the same. We want to make sure that you can do this work academically and compete in our building, that you are somebody who we would want to have in our building, that there's a value add for us, and that your profile and your application fit with what we're trying to build for that class. Is a mediocre GPA able to be overcome with a strong LSAT, or more broadly, which of the two is weighted more? I think a strong LSAT score, right, closer to the median, doesn't necessarily overcome that weaker GPA, but it gets you in the conversation of being admissible if the GPA isn't great, because you've demonstrated that potential that we would like to see in the process. Similarly, a stronger GPA, right? So if you've got a GPA that's stronger, but maybe an LSAT score that's not quite at the median, then maybe there's an opportunity for you to be admitted. But as you saw, that range is 120 to 180, right? If your LSAT score is closer to the 120, even with a strong GPA, it may not be a thing that we can do, just because the red flag, right, that presents is a pretty big and bright one, right? And I think it's probably true of similarly for the LSAT, right? So if you've got a really strong LSAT score, 158, 159, 160, and your undergraduate GPA is, say, a 2.0, the question that it poses, well, why, if you are capable of a 160 on the LSAT, were you not a great student? And I think that an addendum can help there, but it's still such a big red flag that we may not be as confident that admitting you would be a good call for everybody involved. And so it's not an exact science. If you want us to review the file, you've got to apply and give us that chance. Now, is there any particular thing you like to see or don't like to see in a personal statement? What I don't like to see are grammatical errors, spelling errors, right? Things that if you had reviewed this, you would have caught, so we didn't have to find them in this process. I like to see that somebody was thoughtful and that they are presenting the best case that they can for themselves. The most important thing is that it's a solid piece of writing. Did he just imply that we should specify why we want to attend Wayne in the personal statement? I think that it's something that can help us in the process better understand why Wayne is the place for you. It's not an obligation, right? It's not a thing that absolutely has to be there. But let's say theoretically, your application is one that we decide, we want to waitlist you. If we see in that application, in your personal statement, that Wayne is where you want to be and this is why, then when we're going through that process of evaluating waitlisted applicants, we can say, well, this is somebody that we know is going to come if we admit them because we've seen that in their personal statement. So it's just something to think about. Again, it's not an obligation. You're always welcome to submit a separate statement, right? So let's say theoretically, right, you don't want to take up space in your personal statement, you want to submit a subsequent statement that's just about why you want to attend Wayne Law. You can absolutely do that, and those are welcome. Should we ask schools for CAS fee waivers? I think you can, right? I don't know if you would get those, but you can absolutely ask for them. I think the place to start is with LSAC, because they have the ultimate authority as to whether or not they're going to waive that cost, because it is their cost and not the cost of the law school. Can you also tie the CAS GPA into the question regarding the GPA LSAT weight? Well, the CAS GPA is the GPA, right? It's not the GPA that your institution reports. That is the GPA that we use to make that admissions decision. And so we're always using that, and we're not relying on a self-reported GPA or anything of that sort. Remember viewing the type of form that every single law school published, which includes specific details surrounding the demographics and requirements. Faculty, for the life of me, I can't find it. Would you happen to know what it is called? That is called an ABA Standard 509 disclosure or consumer information. If you go to any law school's website, just type in ABA Standard 509 disclosure or consumer information, and it should pop up for you, and you should be able to view all of that info. What is the average amount of debt of Wayne Law graduates? That is not a number I have in my head, but my belief is that it's about $67,000 or $68,000. I could be wrong about that, so so follow up with us directly, and we can get that answer for you more specifically. Does Wayne State do any work with the Innocence Project or Equal Justice Initiative? I don't know if there are any formal relationships there at this point. I can't recall us doing anything with the Innocence Project specifically, or EJI, but if there's somebody out there who wants to come to law school, who wants to do that and wants to help us build that pipeline, we would love to have that if we choose to admit you. What is the average starting income of Wayne Law graduates? I don't know what that number is. The employment rate after graduation, again, all of this stuff is in our ABA Standard 509 disclosure. So if you're thinking about that, I would encourage you to take a look at that to figure out where we stand in that regard. And then, does Wayne Law have a sports and entertainment law concentration? We don't have a sports and entertainment law concentration, but we do offer strong intellectual property law programs and classes. And then there's a sports and entertainment law society, I believe, and some courses that are offered that will touch on topics that will be relevant and important to you as somebody who's interested in sports and entertainment law. What is the median LSAT and GPA score for Wayne Law admitted students? Our targets for next year are a 160 LSAT and a 3.65 GPA. So that is what you are aiming for. If you are aiming for anything, looks like we have exhausted the questions in our chat box, and we are 2 minutes from our stopping time, and I do like to honor the time that I've set for people. So just before we jump here, wanted to introduce you to our team so you all can see that. If you have questions or want to follow up on anything that we've discussed, you can feel free to give us a call at 313-577-3937, or you can email us at lawinquire@wayne.edu. Our Dean of Admissions, Kathy Fox, is always available, as am I. Justin Williams, our Associate Director of Admissions, Jill Burnett Maurice, who's our Graduate Outreach Specialist and a Wayne Law alum. Our current recruiter, Caitlin York, who's a 2020 alum. And then we've got some student ambassadors who, if you want to hear it from a student's mouth, right, about what things are like, they are available to you as well. Sim, Lauren, and Christina. I want to take this opportunity to thank Jill Burnett Maurice for riding side saddle on this and helping on the technical side and filter some of those questions. And my wonderful colleague in communications, Kaylee Place, who is the rock star who puts this together, who's the one who made sure you got the email to register for this and for all of our subsequent sessions. So thank you all for joining us this evening. We look forward to continuing to have these kinds of conversations and present this kind of content. And again, if you have questions or need anything, don't hesitate to reach out. And we'll see you next time. Have a good one.